Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this live broadcast on the science behind the COVID-19 vaccines. My name is Gene Tunick, and I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Innovation, and will serve as today's moderator. The COVID-19 pandemic has profoundly affected everyone's lives. We anticipate that we'll hear the FDA's decision very soon about the emergency use authorization for the first COVID-19 vaccine in the USA. Today, we're joined by a panel of 5 experts from the Bouvé College of Health Sciences who will provide valuable information about the science behind the vaccines and public health implications as the vaccine is rolled out. We prepared some questions for each of the experts, but we encourage you to put your own questions into the comments, and we'll do our best to cover as many questions as we can. Each panel member will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then after all of them are done, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Let's begin with Dr. Mansoor Amiji, University Distinguished Professor of Pharmaceutical Sciences, who will address some questions about vaccine development and clinical trials necessary for FDA approval. Dr. Amiji, we all heard in the media that this vaccine is made using the virus's mRNA, an approach that is novel from all past vaccines. Can you please briefly describe how it's different and describe any evidence from animal or human models that support the safety and efficacy of this type of vaccine?
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Tunick. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to discuss this very important milestone in the development and approval of the COVID-19 vaccines. So first of all, the mRNA vaccines that are the leading candidates, both from Pfizer and Moderna, are not made from viral mRNA. They're actually made from synthetic mRNA, and the way these are designed is that the mRNA molecule was synthesized based on the code for the spike protein. So the genetic code of the spike protein was identified from China in late 2019, and then subsequently companies both in the US and around the world were able to develop the messenger RNA molecule synthetically. The second part of your question, where you address the safety and efficacies, those are, for any pharmaceutical product in the development pipeline, has to meet the safety and efficacy requirement in order to be approved in the United States. And in the context of the vaccines, there are several important considerations. So the first is the clinical trial results that started with phase 1 clinical trial and ended with phase 3 clinical trial have shown generally that these vaccines are safe based on some of the mild symptoms that have been observed, for example, pain at the site of injection, low-grade fever, and some of the others. But generally speaking, we haven't seen, at least in the data that's presented up to now, any major safety concerns. But generally speaking, as these vaccines get to be approved for emergency use authorization, and then subsequently as they're approved for the general use in the public, we may see some additional concerns, which again will allow us to make informed decisions based on that information. But at this point in time, we haven't seen that. And then the other question you had raised, which is in terms of the efficacy. Right now in the clinical trials with the two leading candidates, we are seeing about 90 to 95% efficacy for the two mRNA vaccines, and then about 70% efficacy with the DNA vaccine that is developed by AstraZeneca. And in those efficacy studies, we clearly see a tremendous benefit of vaccine use. In animal studies that have been shown for both the Moderna vaccine as well as the Pfizer vaccine, they've also seen very robust immune response upon administration of the vaccine. And in animal trials, one of the things that you can do, which you cannot do in human studies, is challenge the animals with the virus itself. And again, in those models, they have seen that upon challenge, the vaccines have been able to protect against infection. So overall, the studies that are up to now, the evidence that is presented clearly show that the vaccines are efficacious and safe to be administered based on the analysis up to date.
Thanks, Dr. Amici. That was really helpful. As a follow-up to that, are there any unanswered questions that need further exploration about the safety of the vaccine? For example, individuals with autoimmune conditions, should they be concerned about an autoimmune response that can be caused or triggered by the vaccine? So individuals maybe with cancer or other autoimmune conditions.
So great question. So yes, there are several unanswered questions yet with these, both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. One of the most important one is how long does the immunity last? In the studies that have been done up to now, we have these trials have been ongoing for 10 months. So clearly, we don't have the long-term evaluation of either of these vaccines. We are looking at all the data, even at the phase 3 data, is really restricted to about 6 months or so. And that's what's providing us with all the safety analysis. It's within that period of time. The good news with vaccines, though, is that generally, if there is going to be any side effects or any concerns with vaccines, they tend to occur within that time span in a clinical trial with vaccines. So the fact that right now we have looked at data for up to about 6 months, if there was any serious concerns, it would have been seen in that period of time. We haven't seen those, at least not with these leading candidate vaccines. So it gives us confidence that these vaccines will have a good safety. But again, the bigger question is when you start to create mass immunization and ultimately look at not just the population that was tested within the clinical trial protocol, but more broadly, and start looking at individuals with comorbidities, such as those you described, who may have autoimmune disorders or may suffer from other conditions that compromise their immune system. We are going to start to see some of those unique type of side effect profiles once the vaccine starts to be more broadly distributed. But again, in those scenarios, one of the most important criteria with FDA approval is that there is a phase 4 evaluation period. There is a process called pharmacovigilance that the FDA requires the companies marketing these products to continue to monitor all the safety and efficacy, even beyond the approval process, to ensure that the product are safe and continue to be safe, even as they go to a broader distribution pattern.
Great, thanks, Dr. Amigi. We're going to transition now to Dr. Brandon Dion, who's an assistant clinical professor at the School of Pharmacy and an infectious disease expert with a practice at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Dion, when will the vaccine be available?
Well, thank you, Dr. Tunick, for having me on this panel. And the answer to that question is the first vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, is actually being considered for approval for the emergency use authorization tomorrow. So that may be available very shortly. I think they already have the doses ready to go and ready to distribute as soon as that EUA is approved. But the first group that's going to get it is going to be prioritized primarily for healthcare workers and residents of long-term care facilities. And also the number of doses is still limited. They're still ramping up production. So realistically, for most people, it's probably going to be sometime next year before they have access to the vaccine.
Thanks, Dr. Dion. If you're just tuning in, we're talking about to a panel of experts from the Bouvé College of Health Sciences about the COVID-19 vaccine rollout and the safety and efficacy related to vaccine. For those of you just tuning in, we have 5 experts from the Bouvé College of Health Sciences at Northeastern University. We just had Dr. Amigi provide some valuable information about the vaccine, safety and efficacy, and the type of vaccine. And we're now speaking to Dr. Brandon Dion, an infectious disease expert from the Bouvé College of Health Sciences. So welcome. Dr. Dion, thanks again for commenting on that. Let me follow that question up with a question about how effective vaccines are in general and how this one stacks up against those that have been on the market for a while.
Yeah, so Dr. Amigi pointed out that these the 2 leading candidates right now, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, are both close to 95% effective in preventing symptomatic COVID. And that was versus a placebo arm. And importantly, they're also very effective at preventing severe COVID. So even those patients that had COVID in the Moderna trial, did not have severe COVID, and there were 0 deaths versus 1 death in the placebo arm. So not only are these effective at preventing symptomatic disease at all, they also prevent more severe complications of COVID-19. The other important piece with this is we don't know how they affect transmission. So while they may prevent symptomatic disease, they may still allow people to become infected with COVID-19, with SARS-CoV-2, and have an asymptomatic infection and still continue to spread. So that's one of the big underlying questions that we still don't have an answer to, is it likely will reduce transmission, but we don't know to what degree. There was some hint of that in the AstraZeneca vaccine trials, but the studies for Moderna and Pfizer weren't really powered to detect that. So that's something we still need to know. Dr. Amigi also brought up the question of how long the immunity will last. And that's another answer that we still need to find out. We don't know how long immunity lasts for a natural COVID-19 infection or for the vaccine. And so for right now, the 2 vaccines are both a 2-dose series. And we don't know if they're going to need booster shots at some point in the future. So that's something that we still need to find out, that we'll get more information as we start to roll out the vaccine and get more people immunized and vaccinated against COVID-19.
How would we know that information? Would it require repeated testing to determine what the infection rate is in the vaccinated population? Would that be one way?
Yeah, that's probably going to be the biggest way. It's going to go back to some of that pharmacovigilance that Dr. Amigi talked about, where I'm sure that's going to be an endpoint that the FDA is going to require of the vaccine manufacturers. The CDC will also likely track that, and it may be partly through antibody testing. So they'll actually test patients who are vaccinated blood to see what their levels of antibody are at time points in the future, like let's say 6 months, a year, maybe 2 years after they were vaccinated, which is also what we do with other routine vaccines, especially when they're first approved.
Thanks, Dr. Dion. And one last follow-up. Does it matter which of the 2 available vaccines individuals should get?
So it doesn't right now, because they're both very, very effective, right? They were both about 95% effective. Another piece to this is that they're going to be limited in supply initially. And so realistically, whichever vaccine you have access to is the one that you should get. There are some differences in the vaccines in terms of how they need to be stored. So the Pfizer vaccine has to be stored at this deep freeze, -70 degrees, whereas the Moderna vaccine has to be stored at a -20, which is degrees Celsius, which is a normal freezer temperature. So it may be that people in large populated areas that can use the Pfizer vaccine up a little bit more quickly because it's less stable. That may be what you get when you're in a large populated area. Maybe the Moderna vaccine will be more helpful in some more rural areas because it can be stable up to 30 days in the refrigerator once it's been thawed. So realistically, whichever one you can get access to. And then the other important piece to this will be like I mentioned, they're both a 2-dose series right now. And so the second dose should be the same manufacturer as your first dose. So if you got the Moderna vaccine for your first dose, it should be Moderna for your second. And the time between the doses is a little bit different between the 2. So the Pfizer vaccine is 21 days between the 2 doses. The Moderna is 28. But the CDC is working on ways to help keep track of that. I know I work for Brigham Health System, and we're actually using the electronic medical record to keep track of which vaccine patients get. And I'm sure others will use something similar to that. In addition, the CDC has cards that they're going to distribute when you get a vaccine to keep track.
Interesting. Thanks very much, Dr. Dion. We'll now transition to Dr. Neil Manier, a professor of practice at the Department of Health Sciences and an expert in public health. Dr. Manier was also just elected as the president of the Massachusetts Public Health Association, so I'd like to congratulate him from all of us on this live session. Congratulations, Neil. Dr. Manier,
Thank you, Dr. Tunick. Sorry, go ahead.
Dr. Manier, my question is about the initial rollout of the vaccine. According to news reports, about 100 million doses are slated to roll out in the first batch over the next month or 2, and then a second batch rollout might be happening around May or June. during the next 6 to 12 months, what can we expect in terms of social distancing and mask usage requirements, along with other safety measures as the public starts to get access to the vaccine?
Thank you, Dr. Tunick, and thanks for both the invitation to be a part of the event today and also for the shout out. I really appreciate it. There's clearly a lot of excitement about the vaccine, and sort of many view the availability of this vaccine as the light at the end of a very long and difficult tunnel, and as a ticket to our normal way, back to our normal way of life. So before we talk about masks and social distancing, I'd like to reinforce an important point that Dr. Dion just made. The two vaccines, both the ones from Moderna and the one from Pfizer, they've been shown to significantly reduce the risk of getting sick and, importantly, also developing severe illness after infection. So they're highly protective against developing serious illness or getting sick, but we don't know how effective these vaccines are in terms of reducing the risk for transmitting COVID to others. And that's really the key piece in terms of why we'll need to keep wearing masks and why we'll need to keep practicing social distancing and other good measures after the vaccines have rolled out. The availability of vaccines is a really important step forward and a really important step towards emerging from this pandemic. But because the vaccine trials were tracking individuals who developed COVID-related illness related to the vaccine, as opposed, and they were not necessarily, at least at the time, looking at who was the risk for transmitting the virus, it's possible that there were asymptomatic carriers that were still transmitting. And we still need to keep that possibility in mind after folks start getting the vaccine. So this means that after the vaccines are widely distributed, it's going to be important to continue to wear masks in order to reduce the spread of the virus and, importantly, protect those who are not yet vaccinated and those in the population who might be vulnerable. The same goes for social distancing. I do want to reinforce the piece that around sort of vulnerable populations, individuals who are at higher risk for severe COVID illness. So as these vaccines are being rolled out and that folks in the community are starting to get the vaccine, there's going to be this sense of security that we might feel like, okay, it's okay now. We don't need to wear the mask anymore. We can sort of gather in large groups again. We're not going to be quite there yet. We still need to be safe, be vigilant, and really watch out for those and take care of those around us. The other good practice, hand washing. When it comes to hand washing, that's something that we need to keep up from this point forward. This is good hygiene. It's a great way to make sure that we protect ourselves and others from a variety of illnesses. So those are some of the things that we're going to need to keep on doing for, at least for the foreseeable future, even with the vaccine. Oh, you're muted.
Well, sorry. As a follow-up to that, does one still need to get vaccinated if everyone around us has gotten the vaccine? Can we just rely on herd immunity?
Yes to the vaccination, no to the reliance on herd immunity. So there are a few important reasons for this. So let's start by discussing herd immunity. This is a term that many of us have heard over the past several months, no pun intended. So what does this mean? What do we mean by herd immunity? So herd immunity occurs when a large enough proportion of the population develops immunity to a disease, which makes the spread of infection less likely within that population. So herd immunity can occur through a combination of antibodies that may be produced through vaccination or natural immunity through infections. In essence, those who were previously infected now become immune because they have the antibodies. In many cases, this requires 70% or more of the population to have immunity in order for herd immunity to be present. For COVID-19, it's clear that vaccinations will be a critical part of herd immunity, and we're likely going to need probably over 70 to 80% of the population to be vaccinated before this is possible. And there's still several questions that remain. We don't know how long the immunity from the vaccines will last, as my colleague earlier had mentioned. Do they need to get vaccines every year, every 5 years? So we still need to do more follow-up. So it's important that even as others in the community are getting vaccinated, that each of us does as well. This is what's going to yield the most significant protective effect of the vaccine and help us ultimately conquer this pandemic.
Thanks, Dr. Maynard. This is really helpful information. We're going to move forward with some questions to Dr. Laura Dudley. Dr. Dudley is an associate clinical professor at the Department of Applied Psychology at Bouvé and is an expert in human behavior. Dr. Dudley, why might people be hesitant to get the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, so like my colleagues, I just want to first express my appreciation for inviting me to participate in this panel. This is such an important topic. So to answer your question, there are a number of factors that might cause people to be hesitant or even adamantly opposed to getting the vaccine. From what I understand, the latest polls suggest that approximately 60% of people, and this poll I think was conducted in November, reported that they were likely to get the vaccine. And this is an increase from previous estimates of around 51%. But as we just heard from Dr. Manier, we're really looking for that 70 to 80% of people getting the vaccine in order to really make that difference across the boards. So I think one reason that might cause people to not get the vaccine is that some people probably aren't concerned about getting sick. And so because they don't really perceive that there's a risk of getting COVID, they don't see the need to put themselves through the trouble of getting the vaccine. Another reason might be an underlying mistrust. And this could be sort of general mistrust in medical and pharmaceutical industries. We know, for example, that there's been a history of racism within the medical system where great harm has been committed in the name of science and advancement of medicine. There also might be a mistrust that's specific to the COVID-19 vaccine. So for example, some people have expressed concern that there's been a rush to approve this vaccine without it first perhaps going through the same necessary tests and trials that we've seen with other vaccines. And these people might feel that at best, the vaccine could be ineffective, and maybe at worst, it might be unsafe. And so they might feel that there are potential side effects that have not yet been identified. And as with so many other things, the COVID-19 vaccine has become politicized. So depending on your political party, you might associate the vaccine with the other party, and so you might not trust it.
Thank you, Dr. Dudley. So on a related note, as we're having these conversations over the holidays with our family members, do you have any recommendations for us on how to approach this topic and what the healthy ways of discussing this might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think oftentimes we approach these conversations with the objective of winning the other person over to our side, right? I think that's pretty relatable. We want to convince them that our point of view is right. And I think this is especially true when it's a topic that we feel passionate about. However, when you change your objective from convincing the other person to see your point of view to understanding their point of view, you might find that the conversation is much more productive. And you also might find that the other person begins to try to understand your perspective. So I suggest not making assumptions about why the other person has formed their opinion. For example, don't assume that they're simply misinformed. As I mentioned earlier, you might be speaking with someone who has been previously harmed by medical procedures. So understanding this perspective is really important in bridging that divide between you and the other person.
Very helpful, especially as the holidays approach and those tense conversations are looming around the corner. Thank you. We're going to move to Dr. Alex Vespignani, who's a Sternberg Family University Distinguished Professor of Physics, Computer Science, and Health Sciences. Dr. Vespignani is also the director of the Network Sciences Institute at Northeastern University and has been at the forefront of the national effort to model the COVID-19 spread globally, and has been part of the team advising the White House in the nation's response. Dr. Vespignani, can you please talk about the pandemic in global terms, not just US terms? What do you see as a forecast for the vaccine in the US, but also in the global landscape? You might be muted, Alex.
And as well, yeah. So thank you very much for the invitation to be on this panel. I'm truly happy to be with all these esteemed colleagues, and there is really, they have provided a great picture of what the vaccine is going to be, and what game changer it will be for our managing the pandemic. Yeah, we have to always remember when we talk about a pandemic, we are talking about something that is global. It's not just, we can't, how to say, make predictions or judgment on the pandemic just by looking at one country, actually not even one continent. You know, we have really to have a global perspective. The vaccine is, as we see, is a game changer for sure in the next few months for most of the developed countries. And I'm thinking about United States as well. We have seen already UK, Canada have approved the vaccine use. Europe is going to follow quickly. But, you know, we can't imagine to defeat this pandemic unless we really take into account all the other countries. We can't imagine to have the pandemic under control within our border and then have the pandemic ravaging in other countries, you know, and just imagine the size of and populations of other countries. I'm thinking about India, Pakistan, Africa, Latin America. So these are huge reservoirs of cases that might be reimported in the countries and generate a lot of problems also on the economic side and the way we have to handle transportation, traveling, etc., etc. In addition, we really need to think of a fair and equitable distribution of vaccine so that we can limit and minimize globally deaths. One point I want to stress is that this will be probably, well, you know, what I say from time to time when they are asking me, well, you know, this vaccine was developed in 1 year, what do you think? Well, I think it's like a little bit the man on the moon. It's the first time that as a humankind, we are able to do something on this time scale. At the same time, I think the challenge of distributing this vaccine to billions of individuals in the shortest time possible is a challenge of the same proportion. And it will be a huge amount of work. We need resources, we need all hands on deck, and we need also to be generous and not selfish and think about the humankind in the sense of our planet.
Thanks, Dr. Vespignani. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what are some of the logistical challenges we face with respect to the distribution, the pipeline, the supply chain?
Well, I think some of my colleagues have mentioned that, you know, now there is this, obviously we are all excited. I'm the first one I said, you know, it's the man on the moon and you know, finally we have the vaccine. But we have to be very careful. We don't want to put out a message that starting tomorrow, we will have hundreds of millions of doses of this vaccine. It's not like that. It will trickle down, and even in the best situation, it will take months for us and United States, you know, all those countries that are first in line. And it will take a long time to get to more remote area of the world, to underdeveloped countries. You know, we are facing a challenge of distributing millions of doses of the vaccine. Even for some of the vaccine, we have the problem of the cold chain. Even in places like United States, you can imagine when you move that problem from the United States setting to settings in other parts of the world where, you know, infrastructure are completely different. The amount of people that are able to administer the vaccine, you know, you need still to have people who are, you know, are medical expert people that have to administer the vaccine. These are a vaccine that require 2 doses. So you need to be able to do a follow-up. We were thinking, you know, I think Dr. Dion was mentioning we are setting up a system so that we are really not losing people for the second dose, and it must be the same dose. Well, this is again is a challenge in our country. Just imagine in a specific rural setting of some underdeveloped countries. So these are the huge challenges, especially when you bring those to the numbers that we need. So to really billions of people.
Thank you, Dr. Vespignani. We're nearing the end of our first part of this session, and I'd like to transition to our audience for questions. But before I do, let me ask one final question of our speakers, and this is open to any of you to answer. So, please buzz your buzzer quickly. The question is, when we're in a position to reflect and look back on this year, what might be the main things that we've learned from COVID-19 and our response to it?
Well, I buzz.
Buzz.
Yeah, for sure, we don't have to underestimate the virus and an emerging health threats. We don't have to have the hubris to think that, oh, we will cope with it. It's, our health system can cope with it. And I think the main message is we have to anticipate and not playing the catch-up game. That has been over and over one of the problems. We were catching up with the virus, that was one step ahead of us. Instead, we should always be proactive. We should have mitigation policies in place as soon as possible. We don't have to wait to see, hospital crowded before doing that. We know we can evaluate and project and forecast what is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Yes, perhaps it's difficult to message people and to tell them you don't see yet, but it will happen. And so this is really timely response, the most important things, and a single message that is clearly telling how is hard to fight a disease like this one. We have to be all on board. Otherwise, it's very difficult to fight that.
Thank you, Dr. Vespignani. We're now going to turn to questions that our audience is putting in the comment box. I really encourage everybody to please ask your questions. We're getting quite a few already. We're going to start with this one to Dr. Dion. Dr. Dion, will chronically ill individuals, for example, cancer patients, be considered a priority for the vaccine? Or perhaps are there other demographics and disease patients with conditions who might be considered a priority?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is a section of the CDC that makes recommendations about how to actually implement vaccines, has not officially made their phase 2 recommendations yet, to my knowledge. But those who are at highest risk of severe outcomes from COVID-19, like those with other comorbid conditions like cancer, obesity, heart disease, are likely going to be the next highest priority after the healthcare workers, frontline workers, and long-term care facility residents. So yes, there's definitely a strategy for prioritizing who gets it, and that's probably going to be the next group who's prioritized for the vaccine.
Thank you for that. This next one is for Dr. Amigi and for Dr. Dion, and you guys can tag team on this one. From what I've been told, antibody testing has been extremely inaccurate. Testing for immunity will be difficult if the tests aren't improved. Is there any research to improve antibody testing? Let's start with Dr. Amigi, and then Dr. Dion can comment as well.
Yeah, so again, a very great question, and the person asking the question is absolutely right. The antibody testing for the infection and the ability to recognize the infectivity has not been reliable. There's been a lot of false positive results with antibody testing, and part of it is because the levels of antibody change with infection, and there's different times depending on when the testing is done. You are able to get differential results, and sometimes you get results that are actually not accurate. With the testing that will happen following the vaccine administration, So one of the ways that, at least even in the preclinical studies of these vaccines, to try to see if the vaccine doses were adequate when they were administered, the human infection and the antibody levels in human beings in the convalescent plasma was used as a benchmark to compare the vaccines. And so in that regard, when you're looking at the antibody levels in terms of just to see whether the antibodies are there, certainly that's one, that accurate way to assess this. The tests, of course, will need to be improved. There are some recent developments in this area and some approved antibody tests by the FDA that gives confidence that this technology is going to be developed and even become a more of an accessible point for analysis of whether the vaccine continues to be effective. And so I'm very optimistic on that front.
Yeah, to piggyback on what Dr. Amigi was saying, there have been some tests. There's actually one from a company called Roche that's working on a quantitative test. So rather than just, yes, you have the antibody or no, you don't, they can actually measure the level of antibody to the spike protein, which is what the vaccines target. So we'll need technologies like that to be able to say quantitatively, you have an antibody response of this, and we can actually monitor that over time. And at some point, we'll know what the minimum threshold is. And even that's not 100%, but at least we can look at the response over time, and if there's a significant reduction in antibody levels over time. And then the second part to that will be, in addition to measuring antibody levels, we'll have to continue to monitor people who got vaccinated and see if we start to see increases in symptomatic COVID rates later on, like 6 months to a year after they received the vaccine. And that's something that the CDC definitely will continue to monitor. And those two things together will help us determine whether, how long the protection lasts and whether or not additional doses will be necessary.
Thank you both, Dr. Amigi and Dr. Dion. The next question is from the audience is to Dr. Amigi again. Usually vaccines take 10 to 15 years to be developed. The COVID-19 vaccines have been developed in less than 12 months. Actually, I think I read that it was 63 days from the mRNA sequence to the first shot in the arm. Is there a possibility of anything like safety being compromised? I know that we've talked about this earlier, but I think that this audience member would like you to perhaps elaborate on your past response.
Yes, so a great question again, and certainly, the question, the audience member is very right. The time it has taken from the actual inception to the clinical trial results, and now we are talking about emergency use authorization in the United States, has been unprecedented. 10 months on an approximate time scale. In regular infections, and when you think about vaccine development, the typical period for vaccine development can be as high as 5 years and maybe even 7 years. And in some instances, as we all well know, for example, in HIV/AIDS, we don't even have a vaccine at this point in time. So there are several reasons for why the COVID-19, one of obviously the urgency and the need in this pandemic, and the fact that we have such a high mortality rate, the economic impact, and so much of riding in terms of development of the vaccine. So that's one area that why the vaccine needed to be accelerated in terms of development cycle. But the other part of it, in terms of the question that is being asked, is there been any compromise in terms of safety? In my opinion, no, because there are several important considerations in these two leading vaccine candidates, the mRNA vaccines that both Pfizer and Moderna are developing. These technologies are called platform technology. What that means is that once they identified an mRNA molecule, they were able to create a recipe for the vaccine very quickly because that technology already existed with those companies. So the analogy is, if we were to think about muffins, and Dr. Tunick may like his with blueberries, and I may like mine with chocolate chip, we could switch the ingredients, but the recipe for the muffin will still remain the same, and we'll be able to use that recipe for other applications. So in this context, these mRNA vaccines have been developed relatively quickly because the recipe was already there, and they were able to put in that right mRNA molecule, and then subsequently go to very rapid preclinical and clinical evaluations.
I think it's very uncanny that you know that I like blueberry muffins.
Can I actually chime in on this one?
Please.
So, I mean, I think Dr. Amigi, another thing that he pointed out earlier was that in most cases with vaccines, if people are going to have a reaction, it's going to happen pretty quickly. So we certainly need long-term monitoring and follow-up of people who are immunized, but realistically for most people those reactions are going to happen pretty quick. In the cases of other vaccines, like the Lyme vaccine, for example, where people ended up having like joint pain, that was due to some complication where there's a concern that the protein that was used in the vaccine is actually similar to a protein that's in the body, and there was like an autoimmune response. We don't have that same concern with the spike protein for COVID. And so the likelihood of there being a significant down the road adverse reaction is much, much lower with the COVID vaccine than with other vaccines. So, I mean, we never say never. If anything, I think the bigger concern is just we tested a small number of people. And as you get this out into the real world and patients who aren't as healthy as those who participate in clinical trials, you are going to see some more reactions, but that's true of any drug, and that's just a limitation of clinical trials. So we may see, and actually there were 2 case reports of like an anaphylactic reaction in healthcare workers in Britain that we didn't see in the clinical trial. So we are going to see some new reactions, but I don't have major concerns about long-term effects. Definitely still monitors for them, but.
Thanks, Dr. Dion. In fact, you just touched on something that was asked by an audience member, so I'm going to skip down the list real quick with this follow-up. Could the vaccine affect people with disabilities differently than people without disabilities?
So I think that's a question that we don't have a solid answer to. Based on the way that the vaccine works, it's basically using your cellular machinery to make the spike protein, and then you create antibodies to that. So there's nothing in particular that I would expect would cause a significant reaction among those with other comorbidities, other than in those like these 2 cases where people who are predisposed to allergic reactions. There's also like a lipid coating that's protecting the mRNA, and people could have reactions to that. But there's nothing specific about this vaccine that I would be significantly worried about. I'm curious if Dr. Amigi has thoughts on that as well.
No, so again, I completely agree with Dr. Dion. It's in terms of differences between those who are in the clinical trial versus folks in the broader public. Of course, we will see some additional side effects as it starts to get into the larger population. But I don't believe we are going to see anything specific, especially in those who are in the disabled community. I can't imagine anything that would really be unique to that population.
Thank you both. Dr. Maniar, if people are traveling abroad in between the vaccine doses, do you suggest that they not get the second dose in another country? I'm not even sure if they would be allowed to get another dose in another country. So maybe if you can comment on the logistics with the multiple doses and the travel abroad for this question from our audience.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'll start by just addressing the issue of the multiple doses. It is really important that everyone complete the vaccination schedule. When we talk about the efficacy in these vaccines being highly effective at preventing illness and preventing severe illness, it is when you have both doses. Now, with one dose, there's still some degree of protection, but not nearly the same level as with both doses. If someone is traveling abroad in between doses, one of the things that will be really important is that they practice the same measures as if they had no vaccine at all, which means wearing masks, making sure to practice social distancing, making sure that they keep themselves safe and that they keep those around them safe. In terms of the question of can they get a vaccination, the second dose in another country, I will defer to either Dr. Dion if you know the answer to that, or Dr. Amiji. I don't know the answer to that in terms of what the regulations are around getting a dose, and in terms of the distribution schedule of the vaccination and how they're distributing the vaccine so that they're allocating doses so that they're accounting for the fact that people will get 2 doses. So will that disturb that vaccination schedule, and will it be difficult for someone? I think the one thing that does immediately come to mind is if someone knows that they're going to travel in between this vaccination schedule, to make sure that they talk to their healthcare provider about that and make sure that they have a plan in place for that.
Thank you for that, Dr. Manuar. So this next one is perhaps a little bit related and touches on what you, Dr. Manuar, and you, Dr. Vespignani, talked about in the opening part of the session. And it relates to herd immunity. If a vaccine is approved and distributed in the next few weeks, how quickly, or months in this case, how quickly do you think, in an ideal case, we could reach herd immunity in this country? And I guess the second part of this question from another speaker, audience member, is when might we be able to expect to scale back on some of the preventative measures like mask wearing?
Dr. Vespignani, do you want to tackle the when we'll reach herd immunity? And I can tackle the question about when we can scale back.
Dr. Vespignani can start.
Well, this is again, it's not, it's a logistic problem, in the sense it depends on how many doses we will have available and on the time scale for this availability. So when you talk about 100 million doses, it means the protection of 50 million individuals. So we are still talking about, we are very far from the 70 to 80%. So for sure, I think we have to think about the summer or going even further for reaching what we would call the herd immunity at 70 or 80%. However, there are elements to be more optimistic than that. First of all, unfortunately, in many places in the US, we already have quite a large attack rate of the epidemic, where the attack rate is the number of people who have been infected by COVID-19. So we are talking about places in the US with 20, 30% of the population already infected. So this, in a sense, there is already some fraction of people who are in a sense, for at least for some time, immune or provided immunity by the natural infection. So in a sense, I'm more confident that going into the springtime and the summer, we will see the situation improving considerably. That, however, I think we have to be, and that in terms of the mitigation and the limitations to many of our things in our life, we will be in a better place. If we think about masks is something that allows you to protect yourself and to protect the others. And we have always to think that there will be people at risk or people that are not yet vaccinated that have to be protected. And so probably this is something that we will still have to carry around for some time. But we are getting to the finish line. So at this point, it's a complete different outlook than 2 months ago, when we didn't have the data on the vaccine. And perhaps now Dr. Manuar, what wants to add?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think the one piece I'll add, because certainly, when can we get back to normal seems to be the one of the $1 million questions. And And I think, one way to think about it, because there's unfortunately no clear answer to this question. So the vaccine is a major step forward in helping us re-engage in the activities that have kind of been put on hold because of the pandemic. So I think about seeing friends and family, resuming indoor activities, getting back to a normal school routine, potentially traveling to other countries. I think those are all things that will become more possible, again, while practicing good. You're still going to need to wear a mask. You're still going to need to be cognizant of the risk to those around you and make sure that you keep yourself and others safe. I think there are other things such as large sporting events, crowded concerts, that probably are going to still take quite a while, because for those types of events that are really kind of high risk events, that is going to require, we're truly going to have to be in a situation of herd immunity in those in those cases before we can really start to engage in that without having to wear masks, without having to, really make sure that we're careful. So it's really getting folks to think about the fact that we'll probably scale back or scale ourselves towards a kind of a better normal.
Thank you both. Dr. Dudley, we have a question for you from an audience member about some of the strategies that you talked about earlier in having these difficult and sometimes controversial conversations. The question is how to have these conversations with people who have different viewpoints about the vaccine. For example, individuals who might have different philosophies, but also individuals who might have dementia or children. How do you tackle those types of conversations?
Yeah, it's really tricky. And I think that, again, bringing that lens of kind of coming together rather than coming to the conversation with the objective of winning the person over to see your point of view. And so making it a conversation that is collaborative and in which you're listening to the other person and really taking into account their perspective and their previous experiences is only going to help the conversation. And again, may actually lead to that person better understanding your perspective. I think it does get especially challenging if you're talking about someone who is experiencing dementia, or perhaps a young child who doesn't really understand why they need to get the vaccine. On the other hand, I feel like this is a conversation that parents probably have with a lot of their kids when they're having other vaccines that are, already in the pipeline and already being used regularly. So again, I just think bringing to that conversation compassion for the other person and a willingness to hear their perspective and to hear what it is that has led to them feeling maybe differently than you feel about the vaccine will benefit the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Dudley. We have a few more minutes left in the session, and we have a few more questions to fill that remaining time with. So I'm going to they'll ask the last few questions here from our audience members. This one is for Dr. Dion again, and it's again related to the safety of the vaccine. This audience member is asking whether the vaccine will be safe for pregnant women and young children.
So that's a great question. And we don't have data in this population right now, right? They weren't part of the clinical trials of the vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine, I believe, was 16 and above. The Moderna was 18 and above. And now that they have the adult data, they're starting to study these in children. Pregnant women is always one of the last groups to be studied because there are inherent risks to both the mother and the child. So we may not have data on that right away. And it's really going to end up being a risk-benefit decision. So it's a great question. I wish I had a better answer. I mean, I think based on the fact that few other vaccines have caused adverse reactions in pregnant women, it's probably going to be safe, but I can't say that definitively.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot remaining to study on this front. So in a related note, if you had tested positive for COVID-19, this audience member is asking whether there has to be a certain time elapsed from when you were tested positive until when you would potentially get the vaccine, or can you just get it at any time?
So again, it's hard to know a definitive answer because the patients who were enrolled in the clinical trials didn't have COVID before they got the vaccine. So because we don't know how long the immunity lasts, and the worst thing that happens if you get a vaccine too close is that you'll already have antibodies for the spike protein, and so you might have a stronger reaction. This actually happens often with the vaccine, where the second dose, people will have a stronger reaction, which is actually a good sign that you're responding to the vaccine and having immunity. So that's a possibility, that people who have previously had COVID could have a stronger reaction to the vaccine. But at this point, we don't have any sort of idea of a minimum time frame. And because we don't know how long immunity lasts to natural infection, there are some experts who are saying that patients who have COVID-19 or have had COVID-19 in the past probably should be towards the end of the vaccine, the line for vaccines, because they already have some degree of immunity. So it may be months before you could get the vaccine anyway, and then you may have had, that may be like the minimum time. So yeah, again, no definitive answer, but it's probably okay at any time point. One other thing we didn't talk about is the vaccines, right? The 21 days for Pfizer, 28 for Moderna are a minimum. So in most cases with vaccines, you can always extend that interval out, but you should never shorten it. So worst case, if someone was late on a vaccine, they could always get the second dose later, but they should never get it earlier.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Dr. Tian. In the last couple of minutes, let me ask this question for Dr. Dudley. A lot of folks might have what we colloquially call pandemic fatigue. This is probably every conversation at every household and at every dinner table. How can we prevent pandemic fatigue?
Yeah, I think it's something that we can all relate to in varying degrees. You know, when we talk about this pandemic, it's so interesting because we're all experiencing it simultaneously, but our individual experiences are so different. So it's like this collective experience that is being experienced differently depending on our circumstances. And those circumstances relate to so many different factors. And so what's a struggle for one person might be very different than what's a struggle for another person. But I think that the restrictions, if I understand your question correctly, it's these restrictions that we're having to follow, and then suddenly the restrictions are loosened, but then there's an outbreak, and so then the restrictions return. And this is what we're experiencing here in Massachusetts, where the governor recently kind of stepped us back a bit because of you know, an uptick in cases. And I think it is difficult because, you know, people have a hard time once you've experienced a little bit of freedom having to kind of step back from that. But I think when we can collectively remember that we're keeping each other safe, we're keeping ourselves safe, we're keeping our loved ones safe, and that you know, by following these measures, that's what we can accomplish together. Then I think we can maybe accept the restrictions that are being placed a little bit better. And I'm hearing from people some really creative ways that they are keeping themselves busy and you know, doing some self-care and taking care of each other and loved ones. And one of the ways is by having a lot of these kinds of Zoom meetings together and, you know, connecting in really kind of creative ways. So I hope that people are able to continue to really take care of themselves and others, and that that the light is in fact there at the end of the tunnel, and that we can emerge together again soon.
Thank you, Dr. Dudley. This is a good place, I think, to wrap up this hour session. I know that we've gotten to most of your questions. I apologize if your question wasn't posed. We'll try to have more of these in the future. We really appreciate the audience's engagement with this broadcast, and I want to thank all of our panelists for their time and priceless information that they've shared with us today. I'd like to thank all of you who tuned in and engaged with the broadcast to provide us with questions to pose for our experts. Good night, stay healthy, be safe, and happy holidays.
Thank you.